Where do we come from? For centuries, the greatest question in the history of science had no scientific answer. Then, the first evidence of a human ancestor started a scientific revolution. This is the story of the quest to find the origins of the human race. It spanned a century and a half of obsessive searching. It would make and break the careers of the greatest scientists in the field. For the lucky few, a chance discovery would open a window on the hidden world of our ancestors. Now, from the tiniest fragments of the past, the full story is finally pieced together. Spanning 300,000 generations, over 3 million years. It is the history of our progress from ape to man. The search for the origins of humanity will be a story of bones and the tales they tell. The first chapter of that story will begin here, 40,000 years in the future. In the entrance to this cave, with the discovery of this man. The year is 1856, and the cave lies in what is now the Neander Valley, Germany. Workmen are digging for limestone. It's a vital ingredient in the local chemical industry, but it lies under a layer of rock and dirt. The men get paid a few cents a day to remove the surface layer, and everything in it gets thrown away. But then a spade hits something that doesn't sound like a rock. The shape looks like the top of a skull. And thinking it might be a murder victim, they stop work to show the foreman.
Meneer! Hast du etwas gefunden?
Ja.
Was ist denn das?
It's interesting, but he's seen this kind of thing before. And he's happy to send it the way of all the other bits of bone they found, to be smashed up with the rocks. Yet something makes him change his mind. He knows a local school teacher who might be interested to see it, and the novelty skull gets a reprieve. What he could never imagine is that the skull is seeing the light of day for the first time in more than 40,000 years. Western Europe, 400 centuries before Christ. And the original owner of the skull is a living, breathing being. He is a hunter, a tribal leader, a father of children, and a member of the most successful species on the European continent at this time. He is Neanderthal man. 40,000 years later, high school professor Johann Fuhlrott gets the chance to see the skull for the first time.
Hallo, meneer! Hallo!
A keen amateur geologist and former anatomy student, Fuhlrott has no idea if he's come on a wild goose chase.
Guten Tag. Guten Tag, meneer. Wir haben etwas gefunden.
But the moment he sees the skull, he knows instinctively that this is something extraordinary. It looks fossilized, which would make it thousands of years old, and it's clearly not an animal. But neither is it from a normal, modern human being.
This particular skull is the skull of Neanderthal, and it's big. This individual lived around 50,000 years ago, and by that time Neanderthals had developed a brain that was as large, and in some cases larger than the modern human brain. You notice that it's rather long and low, and it's almost as if you grab the front of a human face and pull it out. You also have this big protruding nose. And in fact, look how large that nose is. So they would have looked different from modern humans if you actually saw one with the flesh on it.
Over 300 Neanderthal remains have been found from Europe to the Middle East. And they all tell the same story. A short, powerful physique, perfectly evolved for the world he lives in. And it's a tough place. Europe is in the early stages of the last great ice age. Within a few centuries, this land will be under a glacier half a mile thick.
At this time, the climate was fluctuating quite extremely. And we do know that they survived some of the major cold snaps, the major glacial advances.
The only way to support advanced life here is with a high-protein meat diet. And that means learn to be a good hunter, or starve.
What we do know from the skeletons, that Neanderthals were very robust, they were very strong, but they also had this huge brain.
The tools found with Neanderthals suggest they developed sophisticated stone technology. Their weapons are the tools of their survival and need to be maintained. If a spear fails at the critical moment, the hunt will fail. Neanderthal males seem to have supported loose family groups of up to a dozen. But this trip has already taken 3 days and covered 10 miles with, so far, no sign of any prey. Then they find animal droppings. Neanderthal nasal cavities are unique among hominids, suggesting a highly evolved sense of smell. And they recognize the scent of red deer. Rubbing the droppings on their skin will help to disguise their approach, if they can catch up with the deer. They've had to range further in recent months to find a kill. Red deer numbers have fallen rapidly, and they have no idea why. But what they don't know is that they have competition. And the competition will one day drive them to extinction. Victorian scientist Johann Fuhlrott holds the evidence of an unknown ancient species.
Wo habt ihr das gefunden?
Wir haben es dort gefunden.
Und was war da sonst noch?
Vielleicht noch ein Bein.
Zeig mir bitte.
It's hard to even guess what the creature was without more evidence,
Nur noch diesen Bein.
and they haven't got much.
Und wo ist der Rest?
Wir haben sie weggeschmissen.
Hat's weggeschmissen?
Ja.
Wenn ihr jetzt noch was findet, schmeißt bitte gar nichts weg. Behaltet es für mich.
Ja, meneer.
Ich nehme jetzt erstmal diese 2 mit. Gut.
Danke.
Fuhlrott gives the bones to more qualified scientists. But even when more pieces emerge from the same cave, they completely fail to identify them. Opinions vary wildly, from a barbarian who'd fought the Roman legions to a lost Russian Cossack, even the victim of some unknown congenital deformity. But a new idea begins to take center stage. Fulrad himself suggests Neanderthal might be an early ancestor of modern man. To many Victorians, this seemed the most absurd notion of them all. Then, in 1859, just 3 years after the bones were found, the notion suddenly catches on. Charles Darwin publishes his groundbreaking work, The Origin of Species. He suggests that all living things had descended from earlier, simpler forms by the process of evolution. And if it was true for every living thing on Earth, then that had to include us.
1859, Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. And a lot of people think that this book was paid attention to, but it wasn't. Most people couldn't care a jot about whether a fish evolved into an amphibian. No one cared. The big question, the question that everybody wanted to know is, where did we come from? And it's in the 1850s and 60s that science steps to the plate and says, I'm going to give you the answer. And boy, did they give us an answer.
If humans had evolved from a simpler form, the implication to the scientific mind is obvious and disturbing. Humans could only have descended from apes. The impact on the Victorian psyche is profound. Many believe evolution will make them little more than animals.
Darwin stayed away from that question. He knew he was going to get into trouble. He writes to friends and says, I'm not going to talk about that. Far too controversial. And it's up to other people, new scientists, a younger generation of scientists, coming on in the 1850s and 60s, seeing an opening, seeing that they could make a career if they were to answer this question, where do humans come from?
Inspired by the Neanderthal bones, evolution becomes the hottest topic of the age. But it will stay little more than a theory without more evidence. Suddenly, scientists' attention turns to an ancestor that would link us to the apes. An ape man, a missing link. And they would go to the ends of the earth to find it. In the late 1800s, the world of science has become obsessed with the idea of a missing link between apes and men. And German scientist Johann Fulrad believes Neanderthal man is that link.
Neanderthal seems so promising when it's first presented. It seems like it's going to be the answer. But on closer inspection, it starts to fall apart. Most importantly, the key fossils just seem to be too much like humans. Neanderthal, at best, is a man with some ape qualities.
Traveling back in time, our Neanderthal stands just 3,000 generations behind us, at around 40,000 years ago. To find a true missing link, therefore, meant going further back in time, to something more ape-like. The question was, how much ape and how much man would it be?
I think the idea of a missing link came from a very simple view of evolution, and it's not surprising it was simple because, of course, these ideas were in their infancy. But people had this idea of fixed types. There were humans and there were apes. And an evolutionary transition between those two types would somehow combine the features of both types. There was no real conception that evolution could operate over vast periods of time, and there could be complex mixtures of characteristics. So people were looking for something essentially that would be halfway between a living human and a living ape.
But where could the evidence be found? By the 1880s, It's believed this has to be where apes and primitive people live side by side. And so, the search moves from Europe to Southeast Asia and the Dutch island colony of Sumatra, home to both man and ape. October 1889. The monsoon season is beginning, and no one tries to negotiate the dense rainforest unless they have to. Two years ago, Eugène Dubois had a promising career as a doctor in Amsterdam, but his obsession with human origins led him to take up the challenge to find the missing link. Now, after abandoning his career and his civilized European home, the great dream has turned into a nightmare.
He's invested everything that he had into finding this missing link. Dubois was the worst kind of person to go out to the field because he had no experience. He doesn't know how to teach his crew. He doesn't know how to take care of them. They're out in the field. It's raining. It's a complete shambles.
He's found caves, which he hoped would produce the fossils he's looking for. They haven't. Now his engineer has given up digging, and all but a few of his convict laborers have run away or are sick. To make matters worse, Dubois has got malaria. The same deadly disease has already claimed the life of his first engineer, and he is about to lose all patience with the second.
Wat ben je aan het doen? Ik ben aan het opruimen. Je moet betalen om dingen te vinden. Wat heb je nou eigenlijk gevonden in de afgelopen 2 weken? Hm? Genoeg. Daar is dit.
His engineer has just lost his workmate, and he hasn't been paid for a month. But this means nothing to Dubois.
Poor Eugene, he desperately wants to find something, desperately wants to make a name for himself. Comes up with absolutely nothing.
After months in the jungle, Dubois has just a few animal fossils to show for the time and money he's spent.
Is dit? Is het alles? Ja, meneer. Nou, dat is net niet goed genoeg.
Dubois had many trials and tribulations, and someone who was not as driven, not as determined, not as obsessed, I'm sure would have given up and gone home.
Daar is niks. We hebben gezocht. En dan kijk je toch weer. Kijk zelf. Sorry. Er zijn genoeg mannen daar. Ik weet niet wat ze voor heel zo lelijk het werk steekt. Oh, vind er een dan. Wat? Je hebt me gehoord. Vind een dan.
Dubois realizes his attempt to find the missing link has been a failure,
Even nog slagen.
and he fires his engineer.
Goed dan. Goed dan.
They leave Sumatra and he goes elsewhere. And he frankly doesn't know where to look other than somewhere in the East Indies.
2 years later, and Dubois has started his search again, this time on the island of Java. And finally, his luck has started to turn. He's fully recovered from malaria, and at last he's got something to look at. Some fossil teeth, which he believes are extremely old and look vaguely ape-like. Dubois now has a new dig site with a bigger team, overseen by the Dutch army. Every so often, they bring him material they think might be of interest. And this day, in October 1891, is one Dubois will never forget.
op.
Today's delivery contains a fossilized skull. Just like Neanderthal 40 years earlier, it's only a skull cap, but like Neanderthal, it sends its discoverer into a frenzy of speculation.
Dankjewel.
The surrounding forests are home to a variety of apes. But he knows that this is not from any known ape. It's too fine. The brain cavity is clearly large. Yet, it's obviously not a human skull. So, could it be an early human ancestor, closer to our ape-like origins? The only thing he can compare it to in his mind is Neanderthal. The first Neanderthal found was 40,000 years old. Unknown to Dubois, his find is roughly 20 times older, between 500,000 and 1 million years old. And it's more primitive than Neanderthal. But is it any closer to being the missing link? The key, Dubois believes, is the size of the brain. He has a precise mathematical model to determine the missing link. Its brain cavity should be precisely half the size of a human and twice the size of a chimpanzee. But when he calculates the brain cavity of his skull, it's the wrong size. It's too big to fit the halfway point, therefore too big to be the ape-like creature he had imagined. And more evidence emerges from the site which simply adds to the confusion for Dubois. A complete fossilized leg bone. Its shape suggests its owner stood upright,